I talk to CEOs all the time who are very happy to say on television that the evidence is in, and then they make these sort of like either backhanded remarks or other things when the camera's off or when my pencil's down, if you will, that make me think that maybe they really still have some skepticism.
Bonjour, and welcome to the City of Love. This is where the romance happens, and happen it did. The Paris Climate Accord was forged. Nearly 200 countries, including the US and China, cozied up, opened a bottle of Bordeaux, and got engaged on the goal of cutting greenhouse gas emissions. But that was then. The honeymoon is over, c'est dommage. And it turns out America wasn't actually looking for a commitment. Remember, more than 50% of all marriages end in divorce. So expect others to follow America's lead. I'll break it all down, then sit down with New York Times reporter Andrew Ross Sorkin, a man who knows a thing or two about the business community's approach to climate change and most everything else they're thinking about. And of course, I've got your puppet regime.
Schadenfreude.
Brexit.
Wunderkind.
Emmanuel Macron.
But first, a word from the folks who help us keep the lights on.
Does seeing this devastation change your opinion at all on climate change, Mr. President?
No.
By polluting the oceans, not mitigating CO2 emissions, and destroying our biodiversity, we are killing our planet.
I talk a lot about our GZERO world, like every week. It's the name of the show. But rarely is there such a clear-cut example of exactly what GZERO means. Remember, GZERO is the idea that a stabilizing role of a US superpower is gone. And a GZERO world, not the G7, not the G20, is where no one country or group of countries is willing or able to take on global leadership. Climate change is one issue that is in desperate need of some direction. Don't expect it. The Paris Accord united us, but then this happened.
I withdrew the United States from the very unfair, horrible, job-killing Paris Climate Accord, which was putting us out of business.
Now, as the G20 summit gets underway in Argentina, President Trump could get some company. Australia is among the world's worst per capita greenhouse gas polluters. They canceled plans to build emission targets into law. Brazil's newly elected president said he'd like to pull his country from the deal altogether. And in Russia, officials might not even mind a little warming, though sending folks to Siberia wouldn't have quite the same bite. While most of the globe is expected to suffer, a recent IMF report found that the Russian economy would actually profit from an increase in global temperatures as melting ice opens new Arctic shipping routes. As for developing countries, the Paris deal was supposed to create a $100 billion fund to help them meet their emissions goals. To date, there's 10% of that amount in the pot. But what of past love? Surely that's going to count for something in these deals. Maybe a bit of Burgundy and a stroll around the Élysée could woo those naysayers back to the table. Here in France and back in Washington, President Trump seemed more affectionate with President Macron than he was with Melania. So where'd that Parisian love affair go? Macron recently spoke to Bloomberg.
Does that mean, for instance, that you wouldn't do a transatlantic trade deal with America?
I think with America disrespecting Paris Agreement, for sure, I could not accept.
Okay, whoa, that's a little different. So where does that leave us? Well, if there's a solution to be found in the West, it may have to come from non-state actors. Think private enterprise, local leaders like mayors or deep-pocketed individuals like Mike Bloomberg, Bill Gates. But don't discount the East altogether. When Trump pulled out of the Paris Accord, many thought Beijing would follow. It didn't. The Chinese, it turned out, love a good old-fashioned vacuum of power, and the world's largest emitter of carbon dioxide is investing big in renewable power. But China, of course, also needs to feed its growing economy and new middle class, which is burning up resources like nobody's business. Population of 1.4 billion will do that. Given that it's probably not realistic that the Paris Accord emissions goals will be reached. So what's that mean? Well, a UN report on global warming says we are nearing a point of no return, where consequences to the planet will be irreversible. Melting ice caps, hundreds of millions exposed to rising sea levels, more powerful storms, more intense droughts, the death of most of our coral reefs. The thing is, as bad as all that sounds, for most of the world's industrialized leaders today, this doesn't yet feel like an acute crisis. So expect politicians to do too little until it gets much, much worse.
I mean, it's true. He literally came out and said, we are a country of values and morals.
Yeah.
He doesn't care. Doesn't want to have a conversation. He doesn't like it. Even if it's just symbolic. I just say, look, this is bad for you, it's bad for me.
My guest today knows quite a bit about the business community and its impact on climate, among other things. Andrew Ross Sorkin. He's a columnist for the New York Times and the founder of its financial flagship report, DealBook. Let's get to our conversation. Andrew, great to be
Thank you for having me. Congratulations on the success of this show.
Thanks, man. Thanks, man. You're
I
gonna
love
be
it.
part of it now. It's awesome. Let me start off because I was just talking about climate, and we kind of know that there's, I guess it was Henry Paulson,
Right.
that said that there is a time for evidence collecting and a time for action. On climate, which of those are we in right now?
Oh, goodness. It depends who you are and what you want. I think within the business community, there are some that actually have taken action and are in the action category. That, by the way, that's not the energy companies. That's the Coca-Colas of the world who've been thinking about some of this for quite some time. And then on the flip side, I think you do have, energy companies, I don't want to say they haven't thought about it. They've thought about it, but I think that they're trying to hold off on this as long as humanly possible because from an economic perspective, that probably
It's a business model problem.
It's a business model. They have a business model problem, so what are they going to do? And then I think there's a lot of people talking about it because guess what? It sounds good to talk about. Are they actually taking steps? I think we're gonna have to see. I think the jury on climate. Look, the evidence is in my mind, and I think in many people's minds. Though I will tell you, I talk to CEOs all the time who are very happy to say on television that the evidence is in, and then they make these sort of like either backhanded remarks or other things when the camera's off or when my pencil's down, if you will, that make me think that maybe they really still have some skepticism.
Are you saying that for most of these guys, and of course it's guys, it's still kind of a box-checking exercise?
I think there's an element of box checking for some, and I think within the energy space, within that world, especially the old version of that, the old world version of that, there's definitely a checkboxing.
I'm asking you in part because we kind of know that the public sector has been slow to the gate and hard to move, and I think there are a lot of people out there that are saying the future is, if we're going to have success,
right,
the success is going to come from all of these CEOs. It's Mike Bloomberg leading the pack of everybody. And what I'm hearing from you is actually, nah, we're not really there yet.
I think we're not there yet. I'd like to say we're there.
Yeah.
I'd like to say somebody thinks, look, it depends who you are. As I said, Elon Musk looks at this as the pivotal problem and challenge of our age and needs to deal with it and thinks, and is going to create innovation as a result of it.
And his company is selling
and
that.
his company is selling that.
Yeah.
I think unless you're in the business of selling that, it gets into the check the box category. It gets into the, does it buy me some goodwill with the public, with my customers? It gets into a much different type of conversation.
So what are the other places where we're still in check the box territory that you kind of wish we weren't?
Well, I mean, for all of the conversation we have about diversity in corporate America, let's get real and let's get very honest. We now have, I think, 5 women
in the
S&P 500.
500, yeah.
We have
lower number than
lower
a couple
than
years
before.
Ago. Yeah.
we have 3 African-American men who run in the S&P 500. 3, only 3. So we're not even into the check the box category. We're not checking any boxes. But there's a lot of this. And so the real question, I think, is going to be, you're not going to see it in the next year or 2, despite all the conversation. I think this is like a 10-year game, and the question is whether, if we sat here a decade from now, you would see a very different looking group of leaders.
Now, it's interesting that, of course, you say 10 years, because it was 10 years ago that we had the financial crisis. It was 10 years ago that Andrew Ross Sorkin became a household name because of the work that you did on Too Big to Fail in outlining that financial crisis. Do you think that any real lessons have been learned by the people, by the principals, the folks that you spend all of your time talking to in that decade?
I do. I think that if you were in that moment, in that time, I think there were a lot of lessons that actually were learned. The unfortunate part, I would contend, is that the leaders that were, and I don't know if it's unfortunate, some people would say it's very fortunate, most of those people are not running the banks anymore.
Right.
So you have a new generation who lived through the crisis, but I don't know if they lived through it at the same level in terms of who's now running them, who's now running these institutions, and what was taken from it. I think there's less risk in the banking system today. I think there's legitimately less risk.
They're not lending.
They're not. It is harder. It's harder to get a loan. It still is hard to get a loan. People, by the way, complain that it's harder to get a loan. You'd think that everyone, all the taxpayers sat around and said, "We gave you all this money, and now you won't give us a loan." So that creates its own political dilemma. But in terms of the lesson, in terms of the risk and the risk appetite that's out there, sure, I think lessons were learned, but I think the memory is short. And I would argue, actually, if there's one lesson we haven't learned at all, is every financial crisis is the function of really only one thing. It's debt. It's leverage in the system. You can have all the bad actors you want on stage doing all the bad things you could possibly imagine. Name your favorite crisis, black hat in the crisis, whether it's the credit rating agencies or bankers gone wild.
George Soros, you name it. Yeah, exactly.
You name, regulators not minding the store, the Fed, whoever you think is the bad guy. It doesn't really matter if everyone's doing everything wrong, unless there is too much debt in the system. That's the match that's going to light the fire. And what I look at today is not so much actually the corporate debt issue so much or anything like that. I actually look at
the sovereign debt issue.
The sovereign debt issue.
In the U.S. and the West.
In the U.S. and the West.
In China, it's the other way around.
It's the other way around. But to me, when you look at a crisis that's related to debt, it becomes a crisis of confidence. That's what it is every time. And so you tell me when you really believe that the Chinese, and this goes back to a much larger issue about relationships and everything else. You tell me when the Chinese say, you know what? I don't know if I like these people. I don't know if they're good for the money. This is less interesting to me. I think that actually, buying something else is more interesting to me. And they publicly say, we're not buying your debt. Even if you believe that they haven't bought our debt or even selling some of our debt, which I think is probably true on both scores.
Yeah, that is true. Yeah.
But to do it publicly.
Which they have not at all done.
Which they have not at all done. I think the day you hear that, or even if they don't do it publicly, say it out loud, the day it gets reported in a meaningful way, is the day I think we're actually going to run into a lot bigger problem.
And is that, in your view, a vulnerability given the level of U.S.-China tensions? Is that something, if you're Trump, you should be worried about?
I would be scared out of my mind. Every American executive that I know that's gone to China in the last 2 or 3 months has come back with that report. The possibility, the prospect that the Chinese not only aren't buying our debt, could be selling our debt, and what happens if and when that becomes public. And do they use that as a hammer in this fight, and how much of a hammer is it or is it not?
So if the Americans are saying we're threatening to disentangle in terms of manufacturing, labor, supply chain, why wouldn't the Chinese do that in terms of
Well, because there is a philosophical and probably just a mathematical debate, which is if the Chinese literally started dumping treasuries, what would that do? They'd
lose a lot of value.
They'd lose a lot of value. who can hold out the longest, what's your threshold for pain, and by the way, how much pain is there really? How much of the market do they really own relative to, and could somebody else come in with more liquidity? I think there are actually legitimate questions on that score.
Now, CEOs took their lumps after the 2008 financial crisis, but politically, the country took a little longer to come back, as it were, and certainly that's a big piece of why Trump is the president today. Draw a line between how the CEOs relate.
It's a straight line. You know, there's a big debate in this country about how the government reacted to the crisis. Should have people been put in jail? Should have we helped homeowners more? All of it. It's an unpopular thing to say, but actually Bill Clinton said it to Tim Geithner. He writes about it in his book. He says, you could have taken Lloyd Blankfein, the CEO of Goldman Sachs, taken him to a dark alley and slit his wrists, and the bloodlust would have risen 2 days later. And that's, I think, very true. People look at all the things that happened after the financial crisis.
And Lloyd's a little guy, so that's part of he's small. The volume of blood would not have been adequate to satiate what clearly would have been demanded.
You guys do a parody or some kind
of
funny
thing? We definitely use this.
Okay.
Absolutely, yeah.
And but the point is, you could have done all these things to help the home. You could have done all these things to help, and I'm not sure it would have helped at all. I don't think that people would have necessarily felt any better. And then Donald Trump came in, and he took advantage of this in, dare I say, the most brilliant way.
The most brutal and the most brilliant way.
You can add the brutal part, but yes.
You wouldn't say that.
I'd say brutal and brilliant.
Yes, you would.
I mean, I look at the financial crisis and the politics of the moment today, the polarization in this country, the anger, the division, all of it started, or at least the inflection point to me was the financial crisis. Because you have to, all of this distrust that we have today in government, in elites, in experts, the idea that you're an expert. We were supposed to trust these people.
In the media?
The media, all of it.
Yep.
Culpable too, all of it.
Yep.
It was 2000, it was the crisis when the public said, these people don't know what they're doing, and we can't trust them anymore. And for years, so many of them felt the pain, real, genuine pain, and said, who do I blame for this? I blame all of these people. And then they blamed each other. I mean, that's where we are today. And so I look at the crisis as really what led to this sort of level of populism and this sense everyone gets inward looking. This happens, by the way, after every financial crisis. This is not some kind of new Trumpian phenomena. Every time there's a deep financial crisis, it is followed by populism. There's a huge debate in this country about what the government should have done in that period, whether they could have helped mortgage owners or done other things, or were too nice to the bankers.
Yeah, sure.
People have gone to prison.
A bunch of people. Yeah. A lot of folks talk about fiduciary responsibility, that we have an obligation to maximize shareholder value. Those are the people that really matter. And that brings us to the box checking exercise and why a lot of people that aren't shareholders. Broad question. Okay. How do you respond to that?
That capitalism is broken?
To the notion that CEOs are doing their job and they're making it work for shareholders, and somehow that is or is not a problem in your view.
Oh, I think it's a problem. I think it's a problem that's very hard to see in the stock price until it's in the stock price. And that's the conundrum. I think that the way the whole framing of the conversation around ESG, which is environmental, social, and governance issues, and just this idea, this kind of feel-good effort, you hear a lot of CEOs now talking about whether they want to be activists and whether they're going to, be part of gun reform, or they're going to deal with climate, or on all of these different issues. Some of them are real, and some of them are marketing.
And what you said, categories. So where are your categories of leaders that are not where they need to be right now?
Tech writ large. And they're having their moment in Washington. They're having their moment, if you will, in terms of the critique and the criticism. And by the way, Wall Street and the banks, they had their moment. And by the way, they'll have another moment. I'm sure. But I think that tech, and this goes to the issue we were talking about, whether it's Jeff Bezos or anybody else, but specifically, obviously, we're seeing with Facebook. We saw it with Yahoo. I mean, that was a company that was terribly mismanaged.
Just completely imploded, yeah.
But Twitter, to some degree, Google, I mean, they've all had their moments, but the moment is trying to appreciate the way the public feels and what their responsibilities are towards the public. And I think that the privacy debate, the data debate is a real one. I think it's not going away at all. And I'm not sure that the Valley, even today, totally gets it.
So is that more a fundamental business model problem, or is it more a individuals, Silicon Valley techno-optimism, libertarian problem?
It's a techno-optimism. You've spent time in Silicon Valley.
I certainly have.
These are the these are professional optimists.
Yes.
They come out of the womb, they're optimistic.
It is not New York, it's true.
It is not New York. Everyone was walking around here, their heads down, they're cold, they're cynical, it's not that. And so if you hang around people all day, I wish I was hanging around those people all day, it'd be fabulous. But
yeah, no, but constitutionally, I don't think you could handle it, actually.
well, my job, both of us, I think, to some degree, are professional skeptics at some level.
Yeah, more. Yeah.
I like to be optimistic, but anyway, the larger point is they live in a bit of a bubble. I think for a very long time, I think they genuinely think they're doing good things, they're doing right, they're bettering society. I genuinely believe they believe that. But I think that there's some real questions about whether that part's true, and I'm not sure they know the answer.
Andrew Ross Sorkin.
Thank you.
Great to be with you, man.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Hi, my name is Tibby Du Bois, and I would like to know why there is a movement to the right, politically, worldwide.
Tibby, I would say that there's really a big movement in worldwide democracies that is anti-establishment, and most of that movement has happened to be on the right. It's not all on the right. Some of it's on the left. Look at the elections we just saw in Mexico with López Obrador. Look at Spain, look at Greece here on the continent of Europe. Even France, to a degree, anti-establishment was occupied a bit more by the left. But if you look at technology and these trends in people getting angry about their governments coming together, you see that it facilitates more tribalism, more nationalism, more identity politics, what social media is really good at sort of articulating, and that the politicians on the right have been most effective at getting those people to have a common voice and be angry with their establishment leaders. That's clearly happened in the United States with Trump. It clearly happened with Brexit in the UK, and it is what we've seen across most of the European electorate and those recent elections in Brazil.
Hey Ian, my name's Keith Dussling. Recently Trump has expressed his concerns about birthright citizenship, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Keith, birthright citizenship is enshrined in the Constitution, which means it's really hard to imagine Trump changing it by executive order. Most lawyers think that's not possible. The Supreme Court would vote against it, in my view. In fact, most of those on the court, particularly on the conservative side, are originalists. In other words, they think of themselves as trying to ensure that the Constitution is upheld as the framers originally intended, not to interpret it for changing times. So I really don't see a change here. But the reason it's become a big issue, like this caravan that we talked about with Central Americans before the border moving up to the United States before the elections, is because it benefits Trump and the Republicans politically. You have the best economy the U.S. has seen in decades, but they didn't believe that was going to turn out a lot of the base because a lot of those people aren't experiencing the benefits personally. But on immigration and on the idea of should people that get to the United States automatically become a citizen, that plays well. I expect to see it again in the run-up to 2020.
Greetings all. We're here with German Chancellor Angela Merkel. Willkommen. Okay, so to help our viewers get to know you a little better, let's do some German-English word association. I'll say a word, and you tell us what first pops into your head, okay?
Ja, okay.
Schadenfreude.
Brexit.
Wunderkind.
Emmanuel Macron.
Volkswagen.
I knew nothing about this. Enough.
Not so much Farfignugan anymore, no, okay. Next one. Zeitgeist.
I'm here, everybody. Hello. You began too early, okay? Disgraceful. What did you miss?
Trump?
Der Trump.
Now it gets interesting. Let's try Bildungsroman.
Please, nobody knows more about buildings than I do, Ian. That I can tell you.
Okay, last one, and it's a biggie. Vergangenheitsbewältigung.
Barack
Hussein.
Obama.
Wunderbar! Nothing brings people together like...
And that's our show this week. We'll be back next week, but not from Paris. Very sad for me. Don't miss it. In the meantime, if you like what you've seen, check us out on GZEROmedia.com.